Primeiramente, atualmente, ele cuida da parte de Primary Markets for Americas pelo braço da London Stock Exchange para fins de investimentos. E hoje a nossa conversa é um tanto quanto a respeito de como os empresários brasileiros, como as empresas brasileiras podem acessar o mercado de capitais de Londres, o mercado de capitais via Bolsa de Londres, London Stock Exchange, e também via o mercado de acesso inicial, que é o mercado WAM. A partir desse momento, vou passar a palavra ao Chris. Chris, the ball is on your court. You're up, my friend. Thanks again for having you with us from GVM Talks and for our audience in order to better explain how the companies, how the entrepreneurs in Brazil can have access to the capital markets in the London Stock Exchange Group.
Okay, Elder, obrigado pelo convite. It's a great honor to be with you guys today. I'll speak in English today. As I said, we've got an international audience. I don't know if Marina can bring up my presentation onto the screen, and then we can start going through that.
Okay.
Cool. That's great. So if we move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I just really wanted to, through this this presentation and talk with Elder, just talk a little bit about what the attractions are for companies from Brazil and actually from the entire of Latin America to think about looking to London to raise capital. And I think that London has a number of very clear differentiating factors that make it attractive for Brazilian companies and companies from the wider Latin American region. So obviously, London is a very important exchange. You know, we're typically in the top 4 or 5 globally for equity capital raising. In addition to that, and I think probably more importantly, we're actually the most international exchange in terms of having foreign companies come and list their equity on our market. And last year, we were the #1 exchange for cross-border IPOs. That just means companies from outside of the UK choosing to use the UK market to IPO. And we actually had a larger market share for that last year than the US did for having international companies IPO. Something that always comes up when I do these conversations is that people expect London to be very expensive. Actually, from a capital markets perspective, London is usually cheaper than both the US and Brazil to do an IPO, which I think is surprising to people. But I'll show you some of the stats that back up that kind of assertion later in the presentation. And I think another thing to realize, and I think this is especially acute for people who are internationally focused and then think about the US, London and the UK tends to be lower cost, but also lower litigation risk. So it's less likely that you'll be sued as a public company if you go public in London. I think it's important to say. We actually have some very...
It's really important to mention that for Brazilian viewers, o que o Chris está dizendo é que as chances de litígio ou de ações judiciais quando você é listado na Bolsa de Londres ou de litígios referentes é bem menor e com custos bem menores do que comparado com outras bolsas, como, por exemplo, a Bolsa dos Estados Unidos, Bolsa do Brasil, ou seja, que o custo total envolvido e as facilidades para se conseguir o acesso são muito maiores na Bolsa de Londres. Please, you may go on.
Quite right, Elder. I think I'll obviously talk about that. I'll also talk about the fact, and again, I think this is something that is really interesting. London is really good in terms of providing a supportive environment for smaller companies. And what I mean by that is specifically companies with equity valuations below $1 billion. Which is not something the US is very strong at. It's not really something that Brazil is very strong at in terms of listing on your domestic market. London is very good when it comes to that, and I'll give you some specific examples. We're also good for larger companies. Yes, we can have multi-billion-dollar IPOs, and in fact, we just had one a few weeks ago by a Chinese company, which I'll talk about. And certainly for larger companies from Brazil that are looking to diversify internationally, London can be an excellent home, and I'll talk about a specific example there. The investor base in London tends to be more international than the US in terms of you get access to UK, European, US, Asian investors in a much more broad way than you do in the US. And of course, London's always been strong for both oil and gas and mining, and I'll talk about some of the specific deals that have happened in that sector, and that's looking very strong for the rest of the year, especially in the area of gold mining, which I think will be very interesting to an audience in South America. And finally, London is a leader in sustainable finance. We've had not just in green bonds, but also in helping companies report their green revenues and make clear to investors what they're doing from a sustainability perspective. London really is a leader in that field, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we go to the next slide. London is one of the biggest financial centers in the world. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. And, for instance, we are the leader in foreign exchange trading. We are the second biggest center for equity assets under management. We have a large amount of foreign equity ownership in London as well. We are the home to the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds. So however you look at it, London really is the global, I'd say the international financial center. There are other very large financial centers around the world, but London is just more international in its nature. And I think that hopefully that will come through my presentation today. Next slide. I think this, kind of proves the point. I just talking about our international nature. London is the leading exchange for having international companies list. So we're ahead of the other exchanges in that regard. And in terms of IPOs, 30% of cross-border IPO capital globally last year was raised in London. So what that means is, this is when a company basically decides to IPO outside of its home market. London had 30% market share, which was the #1 last year. And what I would also say is that we've had 51 new listings. So that's a mixture of IPOs and secondary listings from the Americas since 2017, which is obviously a very large number. And this year promises to be a strong year as well, especially as we seem to be now emerging from the COVID crisis. Next slide. Again, to a point I made earlier, let's compare and contrast the investor base in London with that in the US. In the UK, it tends to be much more geographically diverse. So you can actually see that UK investors make up less than half of the investor base for London listed companies. And in fact, we're able to attract 31% of the ownership of London listed companies actually comes from North America. Whereas if you compare that with the US, what you're seeing is that it is a predominantly North American, in fact, it's predominantly US market. And so you don't really get true international exposure that you would get if you were listed in London. Next. But as I said before, the UK is a very important international market, and we are by far the biggest market for dedicated assets under management. So what this slide actually means is, at the moment, there are $277 billion which are mandated against UK listed equities. So basically this money, if you have a London listing, this money can invest in you. That's by far the biggest in Europe. In fact, it's the second biggest in the world after the US. So what it means is, if you list in London, this $277 billion can potentially invest in you. In addition to that, European mandated funds can also invest in you. So there is a very large pool of capital available for companies that choose to list in London. Next slide. Let's talk about the crisis. So it's kind of interesting to me that London's actually been pretty active during this crisis period. So we've had $30 billion raised in equity in IPOs and follow-on offerings since the start of the year. London basically is 3 times the next biggest European market in that regard. And London is in the top 4. In fact, it's right next to Hong Kong in terms of the amount of money raised. So it's in top 4 globally in the first half in terms of the amount of money raised. And I think there's actually an interesting transaction to highlight there, which is the second one, which is highlighted in the table in the middle. We just had the IPO for China Pacific Insurance, which was a $1.8 billion deal size IPO. And that we have basically have an arrangement with the Shanghai Stock Exchange. It's called Shanghai London Stock Connect. This enables Chinese companies to IPO in London, and it enables companies that are listed in London to list in Shanghai. And we're the only exchange that has this kind of connectivity. And we're seeing now a big move to see deals there with companies going between the two exchanges. So that's a really interesting development. Next slide, please.
On that matter, Chris, it is important to highlight that once the company lists in LLC, it will be able to raise capital and also to get access to other exchange around the world, especially on the Asia markets. Am I correct to assume that?
Well, yes. I mean, this particular arrangement relates to our premium listed companies, so largely listed companies. But yes, that's exactly what it's designed for, is to enable UK listed companies to get access to Chinese investors through that mechanism, through a fast track way of listing in on Shanghai. And it also allows Chinese companies to do the return, which is to raise money through international investors using a London listing. And as you can see, that company, China Pacific Insurance, just raised $1.8 billion. That was only a few weeks ago. So that shows you how issuance is still very active. Now, on this slide, what I wanted to get across here is, and maybe it is not as clear as it should be, if you look at the 2020 year-to-date number, the lighter color is the amount of follow-on offerings that we've had so far this year. So that's basically first half to June 30. Now, what you need to compare that number to is really the dark bar across on 2019. And what it's telling you is we've probably had double the amount of follow-on capital raised in the first half that we had last year. And we've almost already matched the amount of follow-on capital that we had last year as well. So this is, 2020 is only half a year, where all the other years are full years. It shows you that 2020 is going to be a pretty strong year. And even on the IPO side, things have obviously been a little bit subdued because of the crisis, but now they are starting to come back. I just talked about that China deal. We're actually having an AIM IPO, and I'll talk about the difference between AIM and the main market a little bit later, but we're going to have an AIM IPO for a UK company tomorrow. So it seems that IPO activity is coming back, as well as follow-on activity being very strong. Next slide. And again, talking about follow-on activity, I think what is important to understand here is it's very easy in the UK to raise money overnight. So if you want to raise, say, up to 20% of your share capital, this is something that is relatively easy to do. You do not need to have a prospectus. You can raise 20% of your share capital as an existing listed company, and you will have that money within 24 hours. And that has been obviously very, very helpful to companies during the crisis, where they needed to make sure they had additional resources, additional cash on their balance sheet, because obviously there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with certain businesses in the crisis. And then on the right side, you can see that the capital raised in follow-on transactions is across lots of different sectors. So we can see technology has been very active, consumers very active, healthcare, basic materials as well. We've basically had a very broad base of activity across industries during this crisis, and I think that really gets on what is the point of being a public company. It's having this very quick access to capital, significant amounts of capital, and we've been able to show that London listed companies can do that during the crisis. Next slide. Let me do some international comparisons, because I think this is really interesting. I think the first thing to say is when you compare these numbers, I think you need to realize that the US economy is 7 times larger than the UK, give or take. The UK and Brazil are fairly similar, and the UK is a little bit bigger than Canada. But what I want to get across here is that the UK has more international IPOs. On a relative basis, compared to its size, it has by far the most small cap IPOs. If you look at below $500 million of market cap, when you look at below $250 million of market cap at IPO, the UK really does have the strongest market on a relative basis. You know, we have nearly as many IPOs for smaller companies as the US does, despite the fact that the US is far larger. And just to say that this is for deal sizes of 10 million or above. You know, Canada, for instance, has lots of very, very small deals for sub $10 million deal sizes. But, you know, obviously what we're talking about is raising meaningful amounts of capital. And I'll talk again about the differences in size between these markets on some slides that come. But I just really like to get you a flavor for how markets have different structures. Next slide. Again, I said this at the start. People are always surprised by this. London as a capital market.
I was surprised the first time that I saw that 3 to 4 years ago. Was like, man, that's unbelievable. But it's important to show to our viewers, because I think that one of the biggest concern on going public outside Brazil, it's the costs. So please.
Yes. So let's be clear. So the numbers across the top, you know, those are fairly up to date. Those are the 3 years from 2017 to 2019. Those are essentially the fee that the banks charged as a percentage of the deal size. So what you can see is that the US is by far the most expensive, and you know, Brazil is kind of in the middle or to the slightly cheaper side. But what I'd say is in Brazil, there are very few small deals. That's why you've got an NA on the 0 to 50 million deal size. But the UK tends to be the cheapest market. Now, on the bottom, kind of half of the thing of the page, what this is legal fees. And where I got this from was I got some of this from a PwC report, which basically looked at US deal fees for legal fees for IPOs. On the Brazilian side, I got this from an article. This is from 2017, so it needs to be updated. But you know, actually the data was taken from prospectuses from that time. And then the UK data I basically got from talking to a number of law firms and collating their responses. But what was clear to me is that the UK fees for UK IPOs are pretty consistently, there is a distance in terms of how much cheaper they are than other markets. And I'd say that Europe as a whole tends to be cheaper. UK and Europe as a whole tends to be cheaper, but certainly cheaper than the US and indeed cheaper than Brazil. So do not think that London is an expensive place to go public. Now, I'm not saying that doing an IPO is cheap. Doing an IPO anywhere is expensive, but on a relative basis, in London, it is relatively cheaper, is what I would say. Next slide. Right, I think this is really important and interesting slide, actually, because what a lot of people don't understand is a different size focus of markets. Now, if you look to the far right, you've got Brazil and you've got NYSE, and they're very similar. So when I say Brazil, that's actually IPOs on B3. So let's be clear about that. The average market cap IPO is over $2 billion. The average deal size is over 600. It's similar to NYSE. So Brazil tends to have a larger cap focus when it comes to IPOs. Then you kind of go down the size kind of range. NASDAQ tends to be smaller. NASDAQ has a lot of biotech IPOs, which drag this average down. But I would say that for NASDAQ, that number has been increasing pretty consistently over the last 5 years and getting larger and larger each year. Then they've got the main board of TSX, which again is reasonably large. But I would say there aren't that many IPOs actually on TSX. TSX Venture has a lot of IPOs, but they tend to be very, very small. So what I'm trying to get across here is that in terms of London main market, we fit in a gap certainly above TSX Venture, say below NASDAQ. So especially AIM, where we're looking at the typical size of a company going public is $120 million as an example, and you might do a $50 million IPO on AIM. And that is a pretty typical, and we get quite a lot of volume in that space. So there really is a specific size, focus, and niche that I want people to understand when it comes to AIM in particular. And I'll talk about the difference between AIM and the main market in a couple of slides. Next slide. In fact, here it is. So like TSX, we have two markets under the LSE umbrella. They have TSX and TSX Venture. We have the main market and AIM, which are both under the London Stock Exchange umbrella, so to speak. AIM is a growth market that was founded 25 years ago. It has about 900 companies listed on it. AIM was designed for smaller growth companies. It was designed to be more flexible. It has a specific regulatory environment where you use an investment bank or an accountancy firm, which we call a nominated advisor or NOMAD, as the regulator. And for that reason, it does not require a regulated prospectus to be produced. It requires an admission document, which is attested to by the directors and also by this nominated advisor. So AIM is much more flexible in that regard, does not have a specific free float requirement, does not have a specific track record requirement. And also the requirements for corporate governance are less onerous, I would say, than the main market. The main market requires that you have a board which is half independent and also has an independent non-exec chairman. And finally, for significant transactions, so large acquisitions is really what I mean. In most cases, obviously, you might sell a division as well. Main market will typically require shareholder approval for a significant transaction. AIM usually does not require shareholder approval. So it's very good if you've got an acquisition-focused strategy, because it's obviously quicker to do acquisitions in that under that kind of regime. And finally, what I would say about London as a whole, it is not a quarterly reporting environment. It is a half-yearly reporting. So twice a year is when you have to produce financials. That reduces the burden, obviously, on the accounting and financial staff within a company significantly. Is one of the big attractions I find, especially when I talk to US companies. They find this very, very interesting indeed. Next slide. I've obviously mentioned this before in the context of what's happened during the crisis, but I want just to get across a couple of things here. On the left, it is easier in the UK than in the US to sell as an existing shareholder in an IPO. So imagine if you're private equity or venture capital, there is more support from the UK investor base for those investors to sell. So that's what these big gold columns are, basically saying these are existing shareholders, their percentage of the total deal size. So when you get to large deals, it's obviously a much larger, but what it's really saying is, if you're PE or VC, or maybe even a founder, it'll be easy for you to get a cash, at least a partial cash return at the point of IPO, instead of having to wait for the lockup to expire. So that's obviously a huge advantage. Now, on the right side, what I want to get across here is when it comes to follow-on offerings, it is feasible to do a follow-on offering at a single-digit discount to the prevailing share price, and obviously, and also do follow-on offerings which are a large multiple of the average daily trading volume. Obviously, this is good if you are a large shareholder and you want to sell down, or if if you want to do a primary capital raise, you should have the comfort that the capital raise or the sell down will be done close to the existing share price. That's really what this chart means. Next slide.
Chris, may I just ask you a question on the last slide? Does LLC has experience on public companies, like companies held by public entities such as government and etc., on doing some sort of privatization of those companies via the secondary, this transaction, secondary market?
Oh, of course. I mean, if you go back in history, the UK was probably the leader in the world in privatizing its own state-owned companies. And then as a follow-on to that, the UK became the center for state-owned privatizations from places like the Middle East and Africa, from Central and Eastern Europe. The UK has basically been at the forefront of privatization activity since we started it in the 80s. And ever since then, we've been a key player in that kind of market. The UK has typically been, the strongest market for IPOs from places like Africa, Middle East, and former Soviet Union as an example. And we've obviously seen privatizations from those kind of markets on a regular basis over the last few decades and even recently. So yes, that's definitely and as you're hinting at, a lot of those IPOs are predominantly secondary sales by existing state-owned shareholders. And so, yes, that's something that we're very familiar with.
I'm asking you that because I don't know, I believe you are aware that in Brazil, there are being studied and developed some privatization of state-owned entities, but also there will be projects of exploration of state-owned concessions on power, weather, waste recycle, and etc. And mostly of the companies that should participate on those concessions will be in a need of capital, will be in a need of financing, and maybe this can be an opportunity for them to participate on those projects via some sort of financing, some sort of capitalization in the LSE or even the AIM market. We're going to discuss that later.
Yeah, that sounds good. Next slide, please. I just wanted to talk about the quality of the investor base, especially for small companies. So think about AIM, which is focused on smaller companies. On the left-hand side of the chart, you can see there, these are names that pretty much everyone's heard of. BlackRock, T. Rowe Price, Janus Henderson, Capital. These are famous US investors, and yet they're active in pretty small companies in the UK listed on AIM. And on the right side, you can actually see some real examples of these are US-based companies that have come to the UK. So the point I would get across, actually, I think, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk about some specific examples from South America and from North America in terms of what we have companies listed from all over the world. From South America, we have, in addition to this, we have Grupo Clarín from Argentina, we have Antofagasta from Chile, we have Hochschild from Peru, we have Solgo from Ecuador. We have so many of these companies that are listed, but I just wanted to pick out a few, relevant ones. So we have Sarabi Gold from Brazil, who's just coming to mind, Horizonte Minerals. But let me talk about a specific Brazilian example. The one on the left here is RHI Magnesita, which was listed in Sao Paulo and which merged with a European company. That company, the European company was listed in Vienna, the Brazilian company was listed in Sao Paulo. They did a merger. Where did they decide to come back? Where did they decide to list? London. So that really just shows you London is the market for international companies. Neither of those companies had a listing in London before, but they realized that for a truly international company, obviously one with a huge Brazilian footprint, that the best place for them to list would be in London. So it shows that we can take a Brazilian-focused industrials company and we can provide them with a home. And that was basically a direct listing on London Stock Exchange. So we could do direct listings too, like NYSE can. But by the way, these direct listings have been happening for decades in the UK. So for us, we don't see that as any particular innovation. We just see that as something that is just one of the alternatives. So that is RHI Magnesita, which obviously has a strong connection to Brazil. In addition, Petrotal, which is next to it, is a Peruvian oil and gas company. They were listed on TSX and decided to add a listing in London. And since they've done that, they've actually done 2 capital raisings. And what I would also say about them is that they did a capital raising about a month ago, even though their production is shut down, because their production was shut down because of the COVID-19 crisis. They were able, as an oil and gas company, to raise capital in the UK, even though they aren't actually producing any oil and gas at the moment. It shows you that the investors are prepared to look past the crisis and support companies that are listed in London with, as in this example, that all of their assets are in Peru, and it's also a Toronto listed company, but they came to London because they wanted access to a deeper capital base. And just to really kind of hit that point even more acutely, Pure Gold, which is the last one on the slide, that is a Canadian company that is listed on TSX. Their assets are entirely in Canada, and they felt it was necessary to add a London listing to access a broader and deeper investor base. Even though that company is completely Canadian-centric, they saw the benefit of listing in London. And as this is a gold company, it's done very well. It only listed about a year ago in London, and since it's done that, obviously its price has increased, significantly. The gold price has done very well. But I think it shows you something. I'll talk a little bit about mining later, how we're now attracting a lot of Canadian listed companies, Toronto listed companies, to come to London as well, because they see it as adding a much broader investor base. Next slide. So let me talk about growth companies. Now, these three companies are all from the United States. So what I want to get across to you here is growth companies from the US will IPO in London, which I think people find surprising. And it goes to the point that I made earlier. We are better at dealing with smaller companies. So if you look at the market cap of IPO for these companies, they were all relatively small when they did their IPO, and they've all done very well, as you can see from the current market cap. And so we're able to support these size of companies. And what I would say for the two on the side, Realytics and Maxar, they went London first, they raised capital, and now they've both announced that they're going to do a dual listing on NASDAQ, which is, of course, completely rational. They're both US-based companies, but we help them by providing high-quality institutional capital at an earlier stage than they could achieve in the US. And I think this is something that's interesting for Brazil, because there's a lot of VC money that's gone into Brazil. And some of those companies may look and say, well, I'm not really big enough to do an IPO in either Brazil or the US. But what we can show you is even US companies of that size will actually go, well, I should go to the UK first, because the UK can be a stepping stone to the US. Now, the company in the middle is interesting. It's called Boku. It's a fintech company. It does mobile payments. What's interesting for me about this company is a couple of things. It's backed by Andreessen Horowitz, Benchmark, Kozler, Index, and MEA. So some of the most famous venture capitalists in the world. It was founded in San Francisco. It is a US incorporated company. It only had $70 million of revenue at IPO. The rule of thumb in the US is you need to have $100 million of annual revenue before you go public. In the UK, that's not the case. You can be much smaller and go public. And a couple of things about the IPO. The company raised some capital, but actually most of the IPO was a sell down by Index Ventures. So most of that $58.9 million was actually went to the VCs. So they got some cash at the point of IPO. And also this slide is a little bit out of date. The company has done 2 acquisitions and 2 follow-ons since it listed. So it shows that you can use AIM listed stock as an acquisition currency. And also the VCs have been able to sell out of their positions in accelerated deals. So the VCs now have very low ownership of that company. So they've essentially been able to do exactly the same process that they would do on NASDAQ in terms of being able to sell down their position and realizing a cash return for a venture capital backed company from the US. I think this is a model that would be very interesting for technology companies from Brazil in the future. Next slide. One other thing I think in terms, I talked about acquisition strategy and AIM. I'll just highlight this company very quickly. This is a company called Diversified Gas and Oil. It is headquartered in Alabama, does not have any employees or any operations outside of the United States, listed on AIM and raised $50 million in early 2017. Since then, it has done 11 acquisitions with a total value of $1.8 billion and 5 follow-on equity offerings totaling almost $800 million. And essentially it's now almost $1 billion company. And it is just graduated from AIM to the main market. This is really the perfect case study in terms of how you can use AIM as an acquisition platform. So I think this is, an amazing story. As company grew from 90 million to 900 million in market cap in the space of 2.5 years. Next slide. I should probably speed up a little bit, Elder, right? We haven't got that much time left, right?
No, you have time. You have time.
Okay.
Take your time, my friend.
So I wanted to talk briefly about metals and mining. Next slide. London is a very big market for metals and mining, but I think there is a nuance that people perhaps don't understand, which I want to get across. London has 25% of the market capitalization and 4 of the 10 largest listed mining companies. Next slide. And you can see the distribution. And so we have a lot of smaller companies. If you look, in Toronto, Toronto has hundreds and hundreds of very small mining companies, and Toronto is very well known for financing small exploration projects. I think that London is slightly different. And this is why we're seeing, and I'll give a few examples in a second, we're seeing companies from Toronto and Australia now looking to list in London, add a listing, and they don't want to delist from Toronto, Australia. They want to add a London listing because the London investor base gets interested as the companies become slightly more mature. As they go into development and production, then there is an increased appetite from the UK investor base for those kind of companies. And so what we're seeing is Toronto companies add listings in London and ASX companies add listings in London. Again, just to hit the point that the geographic breakdown of the investor base is very international. It's not dominated by the UK. The UK is the biggest, 41%, but you still get 33% of your investor base from North America. I think it's really important to understand you do not need to be listed in the US to access US investors. You can do that through a London listing. It's very important to understand that. Next slide. And again, this talks to the geographic diversity. I just hit this point that the UK is very diverse, whereas NYSE and TSX are not that diverse in terms of their investor base. They tend to be dominated by domestic investors. Next slide. We have companies from the natural resources sector, basically from all over the world listed in London. A lot of those are dual listings. So we have a lot of companies from TSX, a lot of companies from ASX, and actually a lot of companies from Johannesburg as well. Next slide. So give an example, this is a gold mining company. They're listed on ASX. They came to list in London last year. They subsequently have done 2 follow-on transactions. They've managed to expand their investor base and add UK investors and get additional access to capital. And the company's doing very well. Next slide. I talked about Pure Gold. This is the same kind of story. They came to London, even though they are completely focused in Canada. They're already listed in Toronto. They realized that by adding a London listing, they could get access to a much broader investor base. And that's what we've been able to help them achieve during their short time listed in London. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. Let's talk about energy. Energy is a very important market in the UK. And the strange thing is I just talked about mining in Toronto. Before we'd had mining companies from Toronto coming across, we actually had a lot of oil and gas companies from both NYSE and TSX decide to do dual listings in London because London historically has been a very strong market for oil and gas. Obviously, at the moment, the oil and gas segment is somewhat subdued, although we suspect things are starting to recover, and we expect to see a lot more deals from oil and gas coming through in the future. Next slide. We are the second biggest exchange for energy worldwide after NYSE. And you see, it's not just a handful of companies we're talking about. We're talking about a large number of companies as well as a large market cap. And again, if you look at the TSX, I think it's really kind of gives you the point about TSX. The market cap on TSX is relatively small, but the number of companies is very large. So TSX has a lot of very, very small, this is TSX and TSXV, a lot of very, very small companies listed. LSE tends to be more in the kind of middle when it comes to the size of company that we have listed. Next slide. This gives you a kind of an idea of the distribution. You know, we have smaller companies. We have a lot in the 10 to 50 million dollar space of market cap, but we also have a lot in the kind of intermediate space. And in terms of where those businesses are focused, again, it's not really focused in the UK. We have, 70% of the companies that we have listed in energy are focused internationally, including 22% that are focused on the Americas. And we have companies, obviously, that are focused on South America who have come to list in London as well in the energy sector. Next slide. Here's some recent examples, because I think this is very helpful. So Valco, as an example, is a company that was originally listed on NYSE, focused on Africa. We had Valura listed on TSX, that's focused on Turkey. Petrotel listed on TSX, focused on Peru. Gran Tierra listed on TSX, focused on Colombia. Jadestone listed on TSX. I think you're getting the picture. We're having a lot of companies from, and it's not just TSX. We've had ones from NYSE and NASDAQ as well. So TransGlobal listed on NASDAQ as an example. A lot of companies listed on either the US or Canada in oil and gas have decided to do another listing in London to broaden their investor base. And this is now starting to happen in the mining sector. So it's really compelling what we're seeing. The people are just seeing the value in natural resources in having a London listing. Next slide. So let's talk about sustainability. So this isn't just about green bonds. This is actually about green companies and green funds. So we're looking across all different assets in London. We actually own Russell. So if you've heard of the Russell 2000, and if you've heard of the FTSE 100, these are index products, which are our products. So in addition to that, we create custom indexes which focus on sustainability in the green economy and on carbon emissions. And what we really do is we enable investors to be able to make informed decisions about the kind of companies that are investing in from the basis of sustainability. We also enable investors to create products such as ETFs, which track certain types of sustainable factors. So this is not just about green bonds. I think it's important to say. We also have something called the green economy mark, and this is for companies that are listed equity, listed companies, where we looked at them, and if they're generating more than 20% of their revenues from the green economy, they are able to get this green economy mark, and that is a sign to investors that this is a company that has a significant component of its revenues which are from sustainable sources. I think the final thing to say, and I think Elder, you talked about this a little bit earlier, we also have a lot of green funds. So we have public closed-end investment companies which are investing in, say, renewables projects. So we have the US Solar Fund, as an example, which is listed in London. We have ones that are focused on Europe. We have ones that are focused on waste management, as an example. I think it's actually a big opportunity in Latin America for investors to bundle assets together and then list those vehicles and raise capital against them. So I think the investment fund market, specifically focused on sustainable opportunities, is a huge opportunity for us to look at, from certainly in Brazil, but I think in the entire of Latin America. So that's something we're going to focus on going forward. Next page.
Yeah, that have a lot to do with our last conversation, especially because Brazil is now adhering to green bonds. The whole Ministry of Agrotech and Agrobusiness, they are in a need for the Brazilian companies to be seen outside as green companies, as sustainable companies. So I believe that makes a lot of sense, and that we have a lot of projects, especially in Minas Gerais state and the south area of Brazil, and this center-west area of Brazil, that can match those specifics and have access to the capital via green bonds and other green sources of funding.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about that further now. Can I have the next slide? So, we've got just about the green economy mark. Basically, this is something that we do for our index products to show that companies with equity listed on our markets are generating significant amounts of revenue from I think I said 20, it's actually 50. I should have said 50% of their revenue from the green economy. So that's obviously something we introduced. We actually had an IPO earlier in the year that was a company that was backed by KKR, Callison, which is a smart metering company, which actually used the fact that they got the green economy mark in their IPO marketing. And obviously that was a very successful IPO. So this is something that you're going to see a lot more of going forward. Next slide. And we want to help companies with regards to how they report, because part of the issue with ESG reporting is a lack of standards. And what we're trying to do is help companies create kind of taxonomies and also criteria to make the ESG reporting more standardized and easier for investors to understand. Next slide. We launched the sustainable bond market, which includes a green bond segment. And what we did for that was, there are two ways to really be that assigned. It can be if you've already got the green economy mark, but also if you've got a third-party report which says that your bonds are sustainable, then you can qualify for this. I think I've got some stats, and then can you show me the next slide, please? And this is the structure of that. We've already have 42 billion pounds. That's probably about $60 billion raised through these issuances from 59 unique issuers in 17 unique currencies. So it already shows you that our sustainable bond market is really, really large. And I'm going to go into a few specific examples in a second. Next slide. Actually gives you a bit more detail in terms of what you're seeing is, you look at 2020 on the chart below, that's just Q1. So you think about Q1, it's looking that Q1 will easily match 2019. And if you think about who the source of these deals are, government, but also lots of corporates. You've got utilities, you've got financial companies, you've got consumer companies, you've got other, and they're in a variety of currencies. And yes, we do have Brazilian real denominated bonds listed in London. So it's important to understand we have basically every conceivable currency you can think of. And actually London has become quite a center for setting the kind of offshore centers for, for instance, the center for if you want to do offshore Chinese bonds or offshore Indian rupee bonds or Indonesian bonds in rupiah, London's become a center for that kind of activity. And I think we can see a lot of that activity coming forward in Latin America as well. Next slide. So give a specific example. Chile, now they actually used to use a different exchange to list their bonds. Recently, they decided to move to London and do their first, this was actually the first sovereign green bond from Latin America. So BNDES had done a green bond, but obviously that is sovereign related. It is not sovereign itself. So Chile was the first sovereign from Latin America to do a green bond, and they decided to do that in London, and they have since come back and done Euro and US dollar green bonds as add-ons in January. So obviously we were very excited to see this, that we've got such a high quality sovereign as Chile deciding to list their bonds in London. Next slide. And talking about the current moment, IFC listed their bonds in London and decided to do a social bond specifically to help with emerging economies and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was a $1 billion social bond, which was completely focused on helping companies with their response to COVID. And next slide. And we also got the African Development Bank to do the same thing on a sustainable bond market. So they were able to do a $3 billion bond in March. Again, this is focused on helping economies in Africa with dealing with the issues of COVID. So it just shows you how London can support socially focused issuance from from issuers across the entire world. We've got Chile, we've got the African Development, we've got IFC. Just shows you what a strong market is London is for sustainable and social bonds. Next slide. I think I've already talked about this. Basically there are two routes to getting a sustainable bond onto our market. One is kind of an external review. The other one is having the green economy mark and classification through having equities listed in London. I think that might be the last slide. Next slide. I think we're at the end, are we? Yes, we're at the end. Great.
Okay, Chris, thank you for the time, the presentation, the whole knowledge that has been shared with our viewers during this live. I have a couple of questions for you,
of course,
especially aligned to the desire, the main doubts, and also the desire of Brazilian entrepreneurs to get to know a little bit more on how LLC in the AIM marketing can help them to accomplish their dreams on when it comes to develop business, develop economies, and also give the social, give it back to the whole society, and also the profits for the shareholders. On that perspective, I would like to ask you this. Actually, we had a question here related to this. During your exposition, you explained the significant difference between the main market and the access to capital markets via the AIM market.
Yeah.
The question here is what are the advantages or the benefits that Brazilian companies, Brazilian entities can have by accessing capital via the AIM market?
Right. So I think it's important to understand AIM is more flexible as a market. So the requirements to list are not as high as the main market. Now, what I would say with regards to that is that it's something that's very important to understand is that the active investor base for the main market and AIM is essentially the same. There's very little difference. So people would obviously say to me, well, why would I list on the main market if it has higher requirements, if I can access the same investor base through AIM? And one of the reasons why you might go to the main market is because that's where you get passive investment. That's where you get index inclusion. So if you go to the main market, you can be included in the FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 or FTSE all share indices. And that actually delivers quite a lot of passive demand. And that is the advantage to being listed on the main market versus AIM. So usually what I would say is once a company is larger than say, $300 million market cap, then it starts to make sense to look towards the main market versus AIM. Below that level, you're not going to get a lot of passive demand if you are listed on the main market, and AIM is just much more flexible for you as a smaller company. But what I will say is that we have an established path for companies to move from AIM to main market as they get bigger. In fact, one of the companies I talked about, Diversified Gas and Oil, started on AIM, started as a $90 million market cap company. It did all those acquisitions, which AIM was obviously more flexible around. And now it's a $900 million company, and they decided to move to the main market, and they will be included in the main indexes at the next review in September. And that will provide them with substantial passive demand from index funds and ETFs and the like.
It's important that you mentioned that this company access the market via AIM market in order to push forward consolidation plan, because we have been seeing this kind of movement in Brazil of companies doing the acquisitions in order to consolidate some markets that were not used to be looked out by investors in the past. But now they are being more flexible. They are being more interested in do consolidation on those markets. Let me tell you some of the deathcare, health tech services, fintech services, and etc. So I think it's important to have that in mind so the viewers can better understand that if the company match the criteria to access capital via AIM market and also they have a plan or they have a strategy for consolidation, this could be a way to, in order to raise the capital, raise the financings, and have the consolidation plan put all together and executed as soon as possible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just that company is an example that they listed in February 2017, and they did, $1.8 billion of acquisitions in 3 years and raised $800 million of equity. And that company has zero operations in the UK, nothing to do with the UK at all. And they were able to raise the money in the UK.
That's great to know. And another question, so we can finish our webinar. During this whole COVID situation, what was the feeling of LLC and investors, and what was their appetite? What is their appetite for business, for companies, for projects? What is the whole market, the whole investors and the legal assistance, financial assistance, etc.? What are they seeing as a way out for this crisis when it comes to industries, sectors, and also types of companies, size of companies, to be the top 10, let's say top 5 to top 10 from now on?
Right. So I think the big difference between the UK and the US in this environment has been that we had a lot of equity capital raising for companies which had market caps below $1 billion. If you look at the US during this period, and you were a company below $1 billion in market cap, there were basically two types of deals that could happen. You could do a deal for a biotech, or you could do a deal for a SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company. You were not seeing a lot of capital raising in the US by regular companies, is what I would say. In the UK, and I showed the slide earlier, we saw activity across pretty much every sector, and we saw that as well for companies with sub-billion-dollar market caps. Because I think there is a view in the US, you don't want to be a small company and be a public company, it's not worth it. The UK showed why it is worth to be a public company, because we had companies that needed to get capital, and they could get capital within 24 hours. And so they were able to make sure that their balance sheets were safe, and they had enough money to continue and weather the difficulties of the COVID outbreak. Now, what kind of areas have been of real interest in the UK recently? I'd say that healthcare has been incredibly strong. So I'd say health tech and med tech in particular. Also technology. And there are two areas, I think, in technology in particular, fintech, and the other area that's also been a very active has been kind of consumer-focused internet. So companies that sell, say, clothes online or groceries online, those companies have done very well during the crisis. I think also you would see a lot of interest in software as a service as well in the UK right now. So taking a kind of completely different focus, we are seeing a lot of interest in mining, especially in gold mining. But I think that now that is starting to broaden into companies that have exposure to electric vehicles. So you think about companies that are involved in lithium and in copper as examples, and probably nickel as well. There'll be a lot of interest in those companies going forward. I suspect the rest of the year will be more focused on growth companies in tech and healthcare. And we'll see a lot of IPOs for those kind of companies, because they're seen as being not that exposed to the current economic environment. They're seen as being more long-term growth opportunities. And so I think that's where we'll see specific areas of capital raising going forward. I think also from a UK perspective, and this goes to one of the early slides I put up, there is a lot of interest in international companies versus UK-focused companies. Investors in the UK are used to investing in international companies. They want to see companies with international revenues, and the UK market as a whole is not a UK-focused market. It's not a market where lots of companies have pound sterling revenues. If you look at the market as a whole, pound sterling is not the most important driver. There's probably just as many companies that have US dollar revenues. And as I said, we are the market which has the most international companies listed. So that is the focus of the investor base. Okay,
Chris, we reached our time here. Thanks again for your availability to participate on this webinar with us from JVM Advogados. It's a remarkable opportunity to share your expertise, your insights, and the views of the market, especially from the North American and also the European market. I know that you are in New York City right now, doing a lot of business, a lot of meetings. Thanks again for your time, for reserve this 1 hour in order to share your knowledge and your expertise with our viewers. Thanks again. I'll start to speaking in Portuguese, if you don't mind, so I can say goodbye to our viewers. Mais uma vez, obrigado a todos os participantes que participaram durante essa 1 hora de compartilhamento de conhecimentos. O GVM Talks é uma iniciativa do GVM Advogados, com o intuito de compartilhar conhecimento, trazer um pouco mais de luz frente às dúvidas, frente aos desafios enfrentados pelo empresariado brasileiro durante esse momento de Covid e também para auxiliar todos os empresários, empresas e companhias a se prepararem para aproveitar as oportunidades que surgirão após esse período de crise. Uma boa noite a todos, obrigado pela audiência e um abraço.